This is NatSec Matters.
I'm host Michael Allen with Beacon Global Strategies. Today I'm joined by Dr. Ryan Berg, Director of the Americas Program and head of the Future of Venezuela Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Previously, Ryan was a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he helped lead its Latin America Studies program. Ryan Berg joins us today to discuss recent developments in Venezuela and the outlook for the region in coming months. Stay with us as we speak with Dr. Ryan Berg. Ryan, welcome to NatSec Matters.
So great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, Ryan, you're one of the best people in town that we can talk to about Latin American issues and Venezuela in particular. You're well known from your post over at CSIS, and you're an active commentator. So, there were a lot of people saying that the United States had to use force beyond just the boat strikes in Venezuela because they had put an aircraft carrier there. And if you just pulled them out, that would have sent a message of weakness. And so I had gradually signed up to that idea, but I have to admit that I did not have on my list of possible contingencies a Delta Force raid that rendered Maduro out of his palace into a Navy ship and later to New York for trial. Did you see this coming?
Indeed, Mike. It wasn't on my bingo card either, but as you mentioned, frequently out there commentating and writing and narrative shaping on this. I think, in the lead up to this, I had argued in multiple pieces that U.S. credibility was on the line. You can't simply bring the USS Gerald R. Ford to the region as part of this historic naval buildup and not use it to have it sail off into another AOR. I think would have been a massive hit to U.S. credibility. This is not something that was necessarily needed for strikes against suspected narco-laden vessels. So something had to be done there. And then in a subsequent piece in the Wall Street Journal in early December, I wrote about the theory of change. And I thought it was going to be a traditional sort of shock and awe kind of operation where the U.S. would take out, as is traditionally done, air defenses of an adversarial nation and then have some kind of limited objectives after the message had been sent to the Venezuelan armed forces that it was time to leave Maduro's side, right? It was time to open up a space for the opposition. It was time to move this guy out and start a transition. That would essentially have been the message. So neither on your bingo card nor on mine was a Delta Force raid, and one that was conducted as cleanly and precisely as this one. Forever war, this was not. We were in the country for about 2 hours.
Yeah.
We had complete supremacy over the air. We had layered effects, as Dan Kane tells us, from cyber and space. And the Chinese and the Russian weapon systems that Venezuela has spent lavishly on over the past several decades, they didn't work. And there's a major message there about U.S. Military supremacy and planning and the ability to do operations like this jointly.
Yeah, I like that too. I mean, that's sort of a subsidiary benefit of the raid, which is, the Russians aren't going to come over and service the surface-to-air missiles that they sold to you. And at the end of the day, they're not really going to be there with you, even if they're members of this axis of upheaval. But let's get back to, as a setup to the raid, let's talk generally about Venezuela. It's been on everyone's list, I think, among rogue states for a long time, sometimes down the list a little bit. You've heard a lot of criticism, which is, well, you know what, Venezuela is involved in the drug trade, but nothing like Mexico, nothing like Colombia. A little bit about, is this really about migration? Because migration, or at least illegal immigration, is stopped. I mean, do you think that this was appropriately ranked as not only the biggest threat in the hemisphere, but among the biggest national security threats that the United States has?
I think that it's warranted within an administration that is keen on focusing once again on the foundations of U.S. power, which is to say the Western Hemisphere. They feel very firmly, as is clear in their NSS, that they released in December, that the U.S. has lost a lot of ground in the Western Hemisphere. If you look at the country where this administration's top 3 or 4 issues intersects most directly, it's Venezuela. It's the migration issue you mentioned, Michael. It's drugs. And it's the problematic geopolitical adversaries. And really the beachhead that is represented by Venezuela for Russia, for Iran, for China in the hemisphere. China has other partners in the region. China has other presence, of course, in the region. But Venezuela was really its entree into Latin America and the Caribbean in the late 90s and early 2000s when Hugo Chavez came to power. So there's all sorts of reasons to care about Venezuela. And I saw these debates about how much tonnage is actually moved of Colombian cocaine through Venezuela as kind of a sideshow, because the point is Colombian cocaine in large quantities is being moved through Venezuela, among other reasons to care about the country. So I think in the short term, if you understand that this administration is keen on reasserting U.S. dominance over the Western Hemisphere, and in fact they have a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine as what leads the Western Hemisphere section for the National Security Strategy document, I think you quickly understand that Venezuela is the first and foremost challenge. And then I think the long-term challenge is actually getting Mexico to be a more stable, secure environment with some of the criminal organizations and insecurity challenges that operate there. So Venezuela in the short term and probably in the medium term, but Mexico very much in the long term when it comes to hemispheric stability challenges.
Well, great points. I think of all the rationales, evicting Russia and China from the hemisphere might be, my favorite. Let's talk a little bit about what's going on now. I'll tell you, I was also a little surprised that we did the raid, deposed Maduro, but then we elected to sort of promote Maduro's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez. I took it a bit as, instead of, in other words, the democratically elected Maria Corina Machado. And I took it a little bit of as an implicit criticism of the Bush administration and Paul Bremer for taking out the whole Ba'ath Party and decapitating the entire regime. And as is the Trump people saying, well, listen, we're not going to make the same mistake. We're worried about a democratically elected person just kind of coming in here and assuming that she could carte blanche control these very strong security services and otherwise uproot these kleptocratic officials. And so, well, why don't we try to keep a powerful person in office and over time try and, I don't know what, wrestle power from her or have an election. Do I have that right? And were you surprised? And sort of update us here.
I think you do have the right reading, Michael. I was surprised at the raid and the operation, as we mentioned. That wasn't on my bingo card. But once you get to the idea that, okay, that is on the bingo card, that's what President Trump elected to do, and very successfully at that, then I think if you've been paying attention to this administration, you've listened to the president's own words, it makes sense that he wanted to answer the question of political stability first over the question of political legitimacy. So the administration has made no excuses here. That they've essentially said that this could be a potentially awkward dance with the remnants of a regime that we think and we have firm reason to believe is illegitimate, has no democratic mandate, has engaged in gross human rights violations. They're in the International Criminal Court now for crimes against humanity, and I could go down the list. But what they do provide is a chance for short-term stability where we use the economic leverage at our disposal to try to get more pro-U.S. policies from them. And then eventually, if you listen to the three-pronged approach that the Secretary of State laid out, we will get to that third phase after a stabilization and recovery phase. We'll get to a phase called transition. Mm-hmm. And I think that's very clearly where the opposition comes in, right? They should get to run in a free and fair election, and they should get to be able to contest political power in Venezuela as they weren't able to do in so many elections previously.
So what is happening of late? We've heard a lot of assertions, at least as late as last Friday, that United States is running the country, that we're going to try and put more U.S. oil companies in charge, that will set up a bank account, if you will, to help the Venezuelan people from oil proceeds. I mean, what exactly do you think is going on right now? Are we just trying to stabilize and get things moving, or is Rubio the viceroy of Venezuela? Like, what's your sense of what's happening?
I think it's an important question, Michael. So Stephen Miller provided some useful context in an interview with CNN. He said, running Venezuela for us doesn't mean that President Trump sets the bus schedule and the bus fares in Caracas, right? Right. That's not the level of granularity we're going to get to. But what they are concerned about, or what they think is the main tool here, is the ongoing quarantine in the Southern Caribbean, using this large naval presence we've talked about as a way of deciding what goes in and what goes out. And the lifeblood of Venezuela's economy is oil, right? It's 90% or so, 85 to 90% of the revenues generated by the regime are due to oil export. And so the administration is right in understanding that that's their main leverage. And they've said that they plan to use it to extract pro-U.S. policies. And furthermore, they've said that the United States is going to market Venezuelan oil, and it's going to sell Venezuelan oil, and the proceeds of those sales, which will be higher than the proceeds of the sanctioned oil that Venezuela had been selling previously, they will be kept in a foreign asset bank account in the United States for the benefit of the Venezuelan people. Now, that part is clear to me. What's still, I think, unclear, and what I haven't seen enough clarification on, and we're recording this on the 13th of January, is that how that money is going to be spent. Is it simply going to be handed back to the regime? Is the United States going to decide how it's spent for the benefit of the Venezuelan people? Is the key here in the president's words. And we know this regime has a history of not spending or doing anything for the benefit of the Venezuelan people. So there's a key question here. How do you get around a still authoritarian regime and use proceeds from oil sales to benefit the Venezuelan people when they want to be seen as the ones controlling the purse strings?
So that's great. If number one on our list is trying to make sure that the people benefit from the oil revenue when so much of it has been misappropriated and wasted, and et cetera, et cetera. Give us a flavor. What else do you think we're asking of the regime right now to move the ball forward?
So I haven't seen any firm metrics, Michael, but I've seen buckets, I would call them, buckets of different issues that we want them to work on. So we want fewer drugs coming out of Venezuela. We want fewer outbound migrants, and we want migration flights to continue returning at a pace of about 2 a week at present back to Venezuela. We want, obviously, the oil sector to be opened to greater U.S. participation. So we're actively asking for changes to the hydrocarbons law that currently exists in the country and makes it, of course, very difficult for foreign companies to operate. And then I think we have a series of asks when it comes to Venezuela's problematic geopolitical alliances. And so broadly speaking, we want to see less Russia, we want to see less China, we want to see less Iran, and we want to see less Cuba in Venezuela. How exactly that is managed, I think, will be one key question moving forward, Michael, is do we have a firm set of metrics, or do we keep optionality and flexibility open? Mm-hmm. Do we push for rapid ruptures in some of these relationships, or do we ask for a more managed decline in some of these relationships, right? Those are all important questions. And to a certain extent, we're going to run into some red lines for the regime as well. Like if we're trying to push this regime basically as far as we can push it before they say, stability questions are in play, can we ask for a rupture with China? Can we ask for a rupture with Russia? Or are they going to say, we can't do a rupture? We need to do a slow, sort of managed, steady step back from this relationship? Those are the kinds of questions that remain unanswered, and some of the things that I'm looking at and thinking about at this point in time.
All right, well, let's go to Cuba in a minute, but let me just ask you one last thing. That's a great list. What do you think it was about Delcy Rodriguez that told the administration, you know what, I think we can deal with her? I mean, I've read she speaks English, she was educated in California, she's a reasonable person behind closed doors, her brother has good relations with the U.S. government. Like, where did this come from that all of this, I mean, the whole world's focusing on Maria Corina Machado because she's the Nobel Peace Prize winner, and then so here comes Delcy Rodriguez. Tell us how that all went down.
Well, like I said before, the calculation certainly wasn't political legitimacy because she suffers from the political legitimacy same political legitimacy questions Maduro does. I think the calculation was very realpolitik, very realist. If we push for a kind of overnight express regime change from Maduro to Maria Corina, that is a push too far, perhaps in the thinking of the administration. We could get into a situation where political stability is then the major issue to have to resolve. We'd much rather resolve that first, and so the obvious answer is to look to Delcy as the vice president. We should not be under any illusions. She is a self-described Marxist guerrilla. Mm-hmm. In her portfolio, when she was vice president, she oversaw parts of the intelligence apparatus, which included jails, torture centers, other problematic things. I mean, she, according to some reports, is a pragmatist and a technocrat. Maybe she's capable of getting greater oil production in Venezuela, but we should not see this through rose-tinted glasses. That she's a small d Democrat and Maduro was a tyrant. She's part of the same system that ultimately needs to be pushed out of power for there to be real change in Venezuela, and for none of this to have been in vain, to use President Trump's own terms, his own words from the Saturday press conference.
Yeah.
But I think this is going to be a slow process of regime management as opposed to the kind of overnight express regime change that would be involved in the kind of change that you mentioned from Maduro to Maria Corina.
Okay, so before we get to Cuba, one more. I mean, eventually they want to get to what? New elections? I mean, they wouldn't just say in 2 years, Machado, you've already been elected. It's time to install you. It would be, let's have new elections in a year or two. Do you think that's the plan? It's too early to say.
I think that's generally the plan, Michael. I think that the administration wants to keep their flexibility in terms of when those elections might take place, because we already know it's incredibly difficult to push Chavismo to allow anything resembling free and fair elections. The opposition pulled off a marvelous victory in July of 2024 against all odds, basically, taking the tally sheets out of the country to prove that in fact they won. We can't expect them to do that again, right? The key for a new election would be trying to get better, freer, fairer conditions on the ground as best as we can get under this regime. Well, that's going to take a lot of leverage. It's going to take a lot of plotting and strategy, and it's not going to happen quickly. And I think on top of that, the administration wants to keep their flexibility. And so the tightrope here is, how do you keep the opposition relevant? How do you keep someone as talented and as legitimate as Maria Corina Machado? How do you keep her relevant and in the mix while at the same time dealing with the exigencies of the moment, which are basically handled by Delcy Rodriguez and the ruling cupola that's still in power in Venezuela for questions of stability? That's a really difficult tightrope to walk. But just to put it in the president's own terms, he said, we want to make sure that we didn't do this in vain. We want to make sure that we have a chance to make Venezuela great again. And although he didn't use the word democracy in the press conference, there's a means-ends kind of connection here, right? You can easily make the argument that Venezuela doesn't get the oil sector fully roaring again. It doesn't become great again until, contractual obligations can be met, human rights, private property, all the things that we know democracies are better at protecting than authoritarian regimes. There's that means-ends connection there that I would make and say, Venezuela can't be great again unless it returns to its very long and important democratic history prior to 1998.
Yeah. Okay, so Cuba has been a foe of the United States for decades for all kinds of different reasons. But in the last 10 years or more, it's been the relationship with Cuba that often is cited in national security circles as a reason to be particularly concerned about Venezuela. And it usually breaks down to just the pernicious effect that Cuba has on the hemisphere. And it also has to do with their, so-called vaunted intelligence services and security services that were supposedly so fierce the United States could never pick the lock and get into Venezuela or Cuba for that matter.
32 of them perished in the Operation Absolute Resolve because they were the ones nearest to Maduro.
I mean, I don't want to sound like cocky, but I mean, I thought these guys have been described as 10 feet tall for a long time. But what do you talk a little bit about Cuba? Is it still a big foe of the United States? Is it just sort of outdated thinking that we need to worry so much about Cuba that don't we have bigger fish to fry?
Yeah, I would put Cuba in context. I mean, it's an irritant. It's a major, annoyance for the United States. But Venezuela, I think, played far more of a geopolitical role, lubricating China, Russia, and Iran's access and play within the hemisphere than did Cuba. With one possible exception, Michael, and it's something that CSIS and my program has worked on a lot. We've released multiple reports looking at some satellite imagery that actually is tracking the building of several signals intelligence sites by the PRC in Cuba. I don't think they could resist. It's simply so close to the United States. You and I both know Florida is a super important state for the U.S. Armed Forces. There's a bunch of bases all over that state. Things that the Chinese could be super interested in looking at from Cuba, right? Including Southcom, right, the head of the Southern Command. So what we think the Chinese are doing in Cuba is actually building a significant signals intelligence platform. The economy there is moribund, right?
Yeah.
It's nothing works. Cubans have lost a lot of weight. There's a caloric deficit basically nationwide.
Yeah.
And the repressive apparatus remains as repressive as ever, and yet the Cubans refuse to change anything about the economic model on the island. In fact, we have stories, Michael, of Chinese emissaries, Chinese officials coming to Cuba, and their message is, you need to become more capitalist to have success. And the Cubans are very resistant to
how ironic.
change, right? And so, there is some geopolitical play there and some factors, but the Cuban regime, as the president said, could fall of its own accord at any moment. And I don't suspect at this point in time that we're going to see a kind of spectacular military operation the same way we did in Operation Absolute Resolve with Venezuela.
Well, what are the big factors? We're all sitting around talking about what needs to happen in Iran for the protests to succeed, and it's usually something along the lines of you need a broad-based revolt, there needs to be economic problems, there needs to be a leader, Guys like you that track Cuba regularly, do you have a list of factors that would need to be in play for Cuba to finally collapse? Is that even practical? Because I feel like I've been hearing about Cuba's imminent collapse from my entire career.
Yeah, and a number of those factors just aren't in place, Michael. I mean, you don't have a growing insurgency, right? There's no hint somehow of an armed opposition. In fact, when we talk about the opposition in Cuba, it's largely sub rosa. It has to, if it's able to organize at all, it has to do so very carefully, right? Again, the Cuban intelligence services failed in the case of protecting Maduro, but they haven't necessarily fallen away. They're still capable of protecting the Cuban regime. And much of the opposition has been forced into exile. The Cuban regime has been able over the years to find themselves international allies, right? They find those in short supply at the moment right now, but they still have some international support that may step in a moment of existential regime crisis. Repression is still the name of the game in Cuba. It's not like the guys with the guns have stopped firing on citizens. The army, the armed forces there, is very happy. It has billions of dollars sitting in bank accounts. They own much of the economy, as
Amazing.
Miami Herald has done some excellent reporting on what those bank accounts look like and all the industries in which the armed forces as an institution are involved. So I fail to see, as an analyst right now, where the spark comes from, right? Like what's the thing that gets this ignited, and how, what is the theory of change here? Is it a revolt somehow, unarmed, that overruns the Cuban state? Is it finally there's some trigger on power blackouts or hunger or crappy education or infrastructure that gets enough people organized. We just don't know. And so when these probabilities are, less than a couple percent year in and year out that the Cuban regime is going to fall, you generally tend to predict that it's going to persist. And then only retrospectively, when it does fall, and it will fall eventually, you look back and you say, oh, that's the trigger we should have looked at. It should have been obvious to us all along, but it never usually is that obvious to us when we're analyzing in the moment that that's going to be the spark that sets it all off.
Yeah. Okay. I think you're right. I don't see the theory of change right now either. But
that said, Michael, for listeners, if you're interested, I never have done this before, but if you're interested in the betting markets, I looked this morning at some of the betting market sites, and you'll see odds that are better than any to predict whether the Cuban regime will fall this year. I think it's 25%. Wow. By December. I think that's probably the highest I've ever seen it.
I think I saw somebody's going to be investigated for predicting Maduro's fall. They bet a lot of money, like 6 hours before the raid. So I don't think we've heard the end of that story. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with Dr. Ryan Berg.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
All right, let's talk a little bit about further ramifications of this raid. Everyone likes to say, all right, well, Venezuela, they were involved in the, maybe cartel trade a little bit, and they cite some of the cartels that were active. But most people then say, well, the big enchilada is Mexico. That is where the cartels are most active. They dominate more than half the country. Colombia also, despite some success we'd had there through the years, is still at the top of the list. But first, Mexico. I think we're already saying, can the U.S. military come in and help you? And she's saying no. Claudia Sheinbaum is saying no. Tell us, where do things stand with the security relationship between the United States and Mexico?
Well, the administration continues to say that the Mexicans are cooperating, and Secretary Rubio said that they've brought levels of cooperation to points where they've never been before. I believe them, Michael, in the sense that if I had told you at the beginning of 2025 that this administration would move the Overton window with Mexico on security cooperation such that the U.S. would be able to run between 4 and 6 UAVs over Mexico for ISR purposes on a daily basis, you would have said that's crazy.
Yeah.
You would have said the Mexicans will see that as they historically would see it, as a sovereignty violation, and they wouldn't consider it as a policy option. They've not only considered it, but they've greenlighted it. And the Morena party, which has a hard time defending to its base a firm set of policies to cooperate with the United States, they have defended the use of UAVs from the United States in Mexico before. They've said we get useful intelligence from it from the Americans, and we use it to interdict drugs. So I think the administration has moved the Overton window on the possible a lot. When I talk to them and my sense of what they're trying to achieve, they're trying to go even higher. So I give them a very high score for ambition. I wonder how much of it is possible. So they do recognize how much they've moved the Overton window. However, they will usually ask, but have we structurally or systemically changed the way that the cartels operate in Mexico, which is to say, with a lot of collusion from the state, and in some parts of Mexico, probably best described as a narco state? And the answer there is, of course, no.
Yeah.
In 1 year's time, you can't do that. You can't unwind all of these relationships that have been developed over the years. So again, very high marks on ambition. I do wonder how much of this the Mexicans can deliver on, because what essentially the U.S. is asking for, let me translate this for the audience. the U.S. is asking for the Mexican ruling party, Morena, to essentially deliver members, mostly of their party, since they're politically dominant in the country, to U.S. justice, whom they feel have been involved in deals with FTO groups. And that is going to incur a massive cost for Claudia Sheinbaum domestically. And it might be a red line for her. So I do fear we're coming to this kind of collision moment where the U.S. is going to continue pushing, and we may firmly come up against Mexico's red lines in terms of the limits of cooperation.
So let's just lay aside for now the Mexico's historic concerns about the United States intervening in their land and trying to dictate things inside of their country. You know, a million people have told me that what we and the CIA were able to do in Colombia could never work in Mexico. I mean, if you just were the czar here and you could design an effective counter-cartel strategy in Mexico, and it's so much more complex than it is anywhere else. So, I mean, what would you do? It just seems like an intractable problem.
I think one of the roots of the problem, Michael, is that Mexico spends precious little on security. It spends a very little percentage of its GDP on security, and especially relative to the scale of the problem in Mexico. So the first thing is just, Mexico needs to spend more tackling this problem. Second, I think that we need to get back to the idea that we're going to work with only certain vetted units. We've had a number of indications over the last year that corruption has spread even to elite units within Mexico, to the point where we probably have some significant questions about who can we work with in that country if everyone is on the take and information is going to leak very quickly. And then the thing that really gives me the most concern, and I could talk about, where groups are operating and the expansion of their territory and so on, but what really gives me the most concern, Michael, is like how much of the legal economy is becoming or is being taken over by criminal organizations. So even things that are sacred in Mexico, tortilla industry, right? Is being taken over by criminal organizations. The simple produce that Mexico sends to the United States has in many cases touched the hands of cartel members, right? Your limes, your avocados, these kinds of things that are grown in Michoacan state, for example. That's probably touched the hands of some kind of criminal organization, or it's touched the hands of an agricultural worker who's had to pay an extortion fee to a criminal organization. So there's even a term now that we have for the increase that this has on grocery store shelves, narco-inflation.
Wow.
Mexicans are talking about narco-inflation, and soon Americans will probably be talking about it as well. So it's one thing if the criminal organizations are just operating in the shadows and they're doing drugs, or they're doing drugs and migrants, or they're doing drugs, migrants, and wildlife or something like that. But it's another thing, I would argue, Michael, if they're not just doing the illicit stuff, but they're also spreading their tentacles within the licit economy, right? This is trade that's protected by the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. This is trade that is under international law and the most modern free trade agreement that the United States has. And for Mexico to allow many of its sectors to be penetrated significantly by organized crime, I think risks that entire relationship that has made Mexico a middle-income country.
Yeah.
Hitching its wagons to the North American Economic Project and growing as a result. So that, honestly, my biggest concern, and there are many, but the biggest one that I have is just how much they're penetrating the legal economy, and how we can't really isolate it to the illicit side anymore.
So this is, as we begin to wrap up, let me ask one more on Mexico, and then we'll go back to where we started with Venezuela. But, I heard so much about the Colombian president Uribe, who was lauded in some circles as Colombia's George Washington. He worked with the United States. He largely changed the balance of power between the Colombian government and the narcos. Now, there's been a lot of backsliding, and we could talk about that another time, but is that the basic playbook that we would like to see in Mexico? Maybe it's unachievable. Maybe they don't want as much U.S. help. But is that the basic playbook where you have a very strong leader who, as you say, spends more on security, begins to take more seriously than any other, AMLO and everyone else, the penetration of narcos across the government? What do we need to see? Is it so? It's not too far gone, right? Because we briefly and mostly saved Colombia, I think, right?
Yeah, the model is there, and there are a lot of comparisons between Colombia and Mexico across a number of spheres, but especially on security. So since we had a Plan Colombia that was bipartisan, we had a Plan Colombia that achieved results for Colombia, and at the same time, we had security cooperation with Mexico in the form of the Merida Agreement, which achieved rather highly mixed results. And so the question is, what could we do differently? What could we bring from the Colombian context to the Mexican context? And I think one of the biggest things is leadership. You've had 2 presidents in a row now where the credentials on security are a little bit suspect. You're always kind of wondering, are they in bed with the narcos? Are they really going as hard as they can? Or are they protecting certain individuals? Certainly, Sheinbaum has been presented plenty more incentive by the administration to go harder after criminal organizations than the previous government. But there's always questions as well of capability. And then I think that's where we really helped Colombia a lot. We helped them build their capability, both in the intelligence space, but also in the actual policing space. So much so that we have a program now for Colombians to go across the rest of the Latin American region and teach other militaries and police how to battle gangs and criminal organizations. So the same kind of thing needs to happen in Mexico. We need to see some important kind of top-level signaling by the administration there that they're willing to go further. And then the way I read the National Security Strategy document, if you make it past the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, the second thing that the Western Hemisphere section says is, on the question of security, we need to expand the number of partners we have, and we need to enlist them in helping us. And that, to me, is a recognition that the U.S. can't do everything, right? We need a version of burden sharing in our own hemisphere, and we need important signaling, as we got, say, with the Uribe government in Colombia, that the partner is secure, firm, and committed to the same path as we are. And right now, we're cajoling, we're coaxing, we're asking nicely, we're asking not so nicely, we're doing whatever we need to try to get Mexico to where we think we want it. But it's not the same as a Colombian partner that comes in and says, I want to be the best friend of the Americans. Let's see how we can truly defeat some of these criminal groups that are operating on our soil.
Right, that was a terrific tour through some of the top security issues that we have in the hemisphere. Just last topic here, and then we can wrap up. What are you, as an astute observer of Venezuela, what are you looking for over the coming weeks? I mean, you mentioned a lot of points of leverage that the United States has, and you mentioned some things we're looking for cooperation on, but what are you looking for? Are there going to be particular things that you want to see that will be signs of success, or like what's on your list?
Yeah, my answer will be in a way a bit of a recap of some of the things that I've said already. I mean, the first is this issue of metrics, right? Does the administration want to be very flexible in terms of how they judge the regime there, or does it want to have a specific set of metrics? Or maybe it wants to have metrics on some of the issues, but not on others. Secondly would be this question about, do we want significant ruptures in some of these relationships, or do we want to see a slow decline and walk away from Venezuela's relationship with China, Russia, or Iran? What is the regime there capable of delivering? And then, of course, there are questions further. What is the stability of the regime there? We only talked about this briefly, but the administration concluded that Delcy would be the best answer strictly on the question of stability, but never on the question of legitimacy. Is that actually the right bet? Like, is she, in the long run, able to consolidate control, her and her brother, over the executive and legislative functions there? Is she able to box out some of these other regime heavyweights who control important institutions in authoritarian regimes, like the armed forces, like paramilitary groups that roam the streets and rough up opposition members? like parts of the intelligence apparatus? Those will be major questions moving forward. And then the last bucket of questions I would outline for listeners is, when it comes to the president and his choices, how is it that the scheme or the arrangement that Secretary Wright has outlined of the U.S. marketing and selling Venezuelan oil and then putting the proceeds in a U.S. bank account for the benefit of the American and Venezuelan people, how does that work, right? How does that mechanically, how does that work, right? It sounds good when you talk about it, for the oil to benefit both the U.S. and the Venezuelan people. But how is it spent, and how is it actually drawn down to ensure that that those goals are met? That's kind of the meat on the bones that I think the administration needs to provide now. And as an observer, that's what I'll be watching.
Ryan, thank you so much. That was a terrific explanation of what's going down in Venezuela and the other states in the region that are important to U.S. security. So thanks so much for coming on NatSec Matters.
Thanks very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
That was Ryan Berg. I'm Michael Allen. If you enjoy listening to NatSec Matters, please leave us a rating and review. We'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor, please email our team at bgs@bgsdc.com. You can also find this email in the show notes. Please join us next week for another episode of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.